Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship. Warning.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is the Rebel News Daily live stream, and this is the very special Alberta edition, but I'm going to suggest that it is Western focus. So some other things might creep in, and I think that's just fine. Joining me today is my friend and colleague from Calgary, Adam Soos. Hey, Adam, how's it going?
Wonderful. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Now, let's get the nuts and bolts out of the way because we'll start talking and then I'll totally forget what we're actually doing. It'll just be a conversation between two friends. And then I'll remember that, yes, I have to make sure that I tell everybody that there are special ways that they can support us and that YouTube is awful. So let's start there. This is the Rebel News Daily live stream. It used to just be hosted on Friday just by Ezra Levant. But as you know, he's in charge of Canada's largest independent news network, and so he's a busy, busy man. And so now Adam and I host on Mondays. I host on Tuesday and Thursday with David Menzies. I completely forget who hosts on Wednesdays, and Fridays the rotating show of some of the other talent. So anyway, the moral of the story is watch every day because there's a Rebel just for you. We used to just host this show on YouTube, but YouTube, after the election of Biden, sort of the mask slipped. They're not even pretending to be free speech oriented anymore. The free speech upon which they built their platform, they are just censoring it completely and only in one direction, only conservatives. So we start off there, but simultaneously we live stream on other platforms. And the reason we do that is there will come a time in the show, as is the case with every show, that we will hit the red zone of things we can't talk about because YouTube has given us a very comprehensive list of things we can't talk about. And if we talk about them, the channel's gone. So what's going to happen is we'll start off on YouTube and then we'll say not goodbye to our YouTube viewers, but why don't you join us over here on some of these other platforms, please, YouTube viewers. And those other platforms are Rumble and Odyssey and Super U. And on Rumble, Odyssey, and Super U, each one of those platforms has different ways where you can support the work that we do completely willingly, unlike what Justin Trudeau forces our Canadian viewers to do with the CBC and the mainstream media. You can choose to support us because we will never take a dime from Justin Trudeau. And if you do support us, Mr. Producer, or we actually have an intern named Olivia who is also helping. She'll send us the chats and we'll read them on air. And I think I covered all the bases, right?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, bases covered, apparently, AD says. Now, I don't know if it's my side or the office's side or what, but I've got some weird audio issues happening in my ear, and I don't know if it's just noise canceling on my microphone or what. So it could be a me problem, but just as long as everybody at home is hearing things properly, that's really all that matters to me. I can put up with my own audio problems. We should, Adam, get into, and I'll let you key it up, your incredible video about your flag raising campaign. And I want to stop right here and give a very special shout out to K2, who edited that video. And it is one of, I think, the best videos we've ever done here. As far as cinematography goes and editing goes, he just did a great job and made it so compelling. But why don't you tell us all about the campaign?
Well, yeah, so Raise Our Flag is a campaign, and again, first off, to your point with K2, you'll give him a few ideas. I was like, maybe we can do something within Flanders Field, Remembrance Day is coming up, here's where we can shoot, here's a rough idea, and he just weaves it into this incredible, inspirational video. So the intention behind the Raise Our Flag campaign, and you can check it out at raiseourflag.ca, is with Remembrance Day looming, and just generally speaking, it's very important that those flags be raised to honor the people who paid the ultimate price and fought for our freedoms, fought for us to be able to fly the flag. Justin Trudeau has repeatedly said that we need to earn that right again. And as I say in the video, I don't think men like Justin Trudeau would ever earn the right to fly any flag. It was the men and women who went overseas, the men and women in our armed forces, and the people who stood for freedoms without compromise, even if that meant paying the ultimate price. Now, the other side of this story, obviously terrible things happen with residential schools. There is the unmarked graves. There is a legacy there. But as you'll see in the video, we can be both in favor of raising the flags and helping our Indigenous communities. This isn't about one or the other. It's about doing the fundamentally Canadian thing, and that's about doing the right thing. And that means when people overseas are in need of help, when there's villainy afoot, we go and we do the right thing and we stand up and we defend those people. There's many countries in Europe to this very day. The Canadian flag is a great sort of herald of victories past, or at least defenses past, and Canadians are welcome with open arms. We need that same level of heroism, that same caliber of men and women in Canada fighting on Indigenous issues. Lowering the flag does nothing to help the kids who can't turn on the water and have a bath because it's acidic or because there's cancer-causing agents in there. All the virtue signaling that Justin Trudeau has done very little to help these people. And we're going to talk about another story about the Liberals' lack of action on Indigenous schools in residential schools, particularly, in just a moment. But I think first, to stay on this Raise Our Flags video, if AD's got it queued up, let's just watch the video and then we can discuss it a little bit.
No audio, AD.
That mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below.
So when we decided to bring down those masks, those flags to half-mast, we made the commitment that we would not raise them again until we had worked enough with Indigenous communities and leadership to make a clear determination that it was time to raise them again and continue the hard work of reconciliation.
We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields.
Canada will always lower its flags to half-mast, and where we will always fly the flag of truth and reconciliation designed by the National Council of Truth and Reconciliation.
Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies crow in Flanders fields.
You have undoubtedly noticed that flags across Canada are at half-mast in recognition of the residential schools' discoveries of mass graves across this country. Justin Trudeau says that we as Canadians need to once again earn the right to fly that flag. I, for one, think that men like Justin Trudeau would never earn that right. The right to fly that flag was bought and paid for by the men and women who gave up their lives fighting for this country and fighting for our freedom. And dishonoring their unmarked graves overseas, those who gave up their lives, does nothing to honor the unmarked graves of Indigenous communities here in Canada. Raising the flags in recognition of fallen soldiers is a small signifier of our appreciation for what they have done for this country. On the other hand, lowering the flags in a sign of solidarity with Indigenous communities does nothing to alleviate their ongoing suffering. On the first holiday designated to commemorate and work towards truth and reconciliation, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau refused to meet with people and go to an unmarked grave. He instead went surfing in Tofino.
As part of the commemoration of the very first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, in this arbor, a journalist quietly informed us that the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was on vacation in Tofino.
The Indigenous communities in this country need help. They need concrete action. They don't need symbols and signifiers, and despite how Canadian it is to say sorry, they don't need apologies any longer. They need action. When faced with great troubles overseas, Canadians needed men and women of action to stand up and sometimes pay the ultimate price.
Why are we still fighting against certain veterans groups in court? Because they're asking for more than we are able to give right now.
The Indigenous community in this country also needs people of action. They need people who will provide clean drinking water for them, address poverty, and address the suffering that is taking place on reserves. They need heroes like the heroes who went overseas to fight for us. They need those types of heroes fighting for them. The politicians who have been hesitant to call for our flag to be raised are the same who have been inactive on Indigenous issues that are unfolding this very day. Justin Trudeau is more likely to pause for a photo op than he is to dare help a single Indigenous person.
They invited you.
We need change. We need to honor those who are suffering and to honor those soldiers who have suffered for our freedom. We can do both. We are asking our politicians to be accountable and to actually take action to help Indigenous communities. And furthermore, we're asking Canadians to help honor soldiers by raising our flags across this great nation. We're asking you to go to raiseourflag.ca. On that website, you'll also have an opportunity to have a message sent directly to Justin Trudeau. Sign our petition and demand that we honor both Indigenous communities and Canadian soldiers.
Yeah. And the thing that really strikes me... Yeah.
Go ahead.
Watching it again, the thing that really strikes me is this, the general treatment of what's happening, speaking to Indigenous issues. If we're only talking about the past and dwelling on that and virtue signaling on that, what we're seeing from politicians is they're excusing themselves from addressing the real issues that are happening today. So they can tweet and go for a photo op, but they're not getting to work on the issues today. And some of these issues, we talked to Jocelyn Bergic and a number of other Indigenous water rights activists, and the universal sentiment is there that there is enough money there, and if there was a willingness to go after some of these companies, these engineering firms like SNC-Lavalin, and actually have some agency and demand that they be accountable and transparent, that the majority of these long-term boil water advisories would simply, excuse the pun, but evaporate. This is an issue that is resolvable, and it's resolvable not within 20 or 30 years, it's resolvable within 10 years. But so long as our politicians are absolutely focused on what happened in the distant past, in 30 years, we're going to be looking back on this period right now the same way we look at residential schools, saying, how did these people not do anything? And the same way John Chretien today said, well, he didn't know what was happening in the residential schools. Justin Trudeau's not going to be able to say, because of all this coverage, he didn't know. They're going to be accountable for what's happening to Indigenous kids today. So that's one side of the story. The other side is our veterans have been treated absolutely dreadfully under Justin Trudeau, disrespected. While terrorists are getting $10 million payouts, veterans are fighting in court for basic rights, basic Canadian rights, and for some acknowledgement of the service that they paid, whether they were injured or they're dealing with PTSD. They've been categorically disrespected, and with Remembrance Day fast approaching, I'm hoping, and I think people need to go to raiseourflag.ca and sign that petition. By Remembrance Day, we need to have flags up across this country to honor those people who paid that price.
You know, I would suggest it needs to happen even faster than that. Normally, it's sort of the 1st of November is when we sort of get into Remembrance Day season, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I think that's the least we can do to honor these men and women who died for our right to say whatever we want right now, to give them 11 days. And I thought it was interesting, some of the remarks that K2 dug up regarding Justin Trudeau. So I want to ask you this, because I don't think a lot of people really realize how long these flags have been down. When did they come down?
Oh, when would it have been? Was it
June?
I mean, it was before July. I think it was before July.
Yeah. So
I think it's been like upwards of 6 months or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Justin Trudeau's remarks, sorry to cut you off, but Justin Trudeau's remarks said that he won't raise the flag until he's worked enough with Indigenous communities to justify raising the flag, which could be never. Ending the boil water advisories, it was a campaign promise in 2014, 2015. This is crazy. We're putting this on him to get the job done. We know he's never going to get the job done. He's never got the job done on anything, but specifically this one issue.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that's absolutely wild about this, and I'm just hearing in my ear that is May 30th, that those flags went down. It's just another in the long stretch of promises and virtue signaling that doesn't actually get to action items. Like, this is a trans-political issue. It doesn't matter if you're conservative, liberal, apolitical, the most radical conspiracy theorist. It doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum. If you're a fundamentally decent human being, you are just simply going to agree that we need to get water to Indigenous communities. Particularly, there are Indigenous kids, Canadians in this country, who can't turn on the tap. When I was talking to Jocelyn Bergewick of Sundance Construction, she said some of the kids can only bathe once a week because the water is so acidic that it'll actually damage their skin. That's happening in Canada right now. This is an issue that I don't care which leader of which party you are. They're all saying, well, we need to do something about this. We need a politician who literally says enough is enough and goes out and does it. And we need someone who's not going to say, well, it's a long-term goal, or they're not going to say we're going to lower the flags until things get done. We need someone who's going to say we're dealing with these five situations that are the longest ones in the next 6 months. We need concrete action plans for these people, because enough is enough. We're just reliving the history of categorical abuse, not providing drinking water and not providing safe drinking water, or furthermore, encouraging people to use water that has cancer-causing agents in it or causes literally burns on skin. Mercury, exactly. It's on par with plucking children away from their families. Like, it's absolutely abhorrent and unbelievable that this is happening in Canada today. And like we've said, lowering those flags does nothing to address that horrid wrong that's happening right now.
Well, we just have to look at Justin Trudeau's treatment of the military. I mean, his treatment of the military, I mean, these two groups of people he's treating so terribly, but he's saying, but look, I lowered the flags. I mean, he's had his own cabinet minister call the Taliban her brothers. Nobody in the nobody in the government has ever called the military their brothers. And then, Justin Trudeau, he kneels with a teddy bear at a residential school site, and I guess that's doing something. But all he's tangibly done is force everybody else to lower their flags.
And the absolutely wild thing about this is when you look at whose side Justin Trudeau is on. Back in the day, and not that any prime minister has dealt with Indigenous issues rightly, because nobody's really resolved the water drinking issues, but back in the day when Stephen Harper wanted to increase transparency to see what's happening with some of these water projects, to see how the funds are being used, they attacked it as though it was an invasion of Indigenous rights. The majority of these Indigenous people who want clean water wanted that transparency so they could see why it wasn't happening. So on the Indigenous issue, where you have kids who can't have a glass of water, he sided with covering up on behalf of SNC-Lavalin and these other major firms, engineering firms, who are the ones who are mismanaging this project and making millions of dollars. Lots of them, his friends, some of them were in his bridal party, like in his wedding party. So personal friends of his, they're benefiting. Then you go and you look at the veterans issues. Veterans are in court battling the same way Indigenous kids are in court battling, but these veterans are battling for their fair share for what they've gone through. And look whose side Justin Trudeau is on. He's giving $10 million to Omar Khadr. Like, on every issue, he's on the worst possible spectrum. There's no balance. He seems to just side with the people who are benefiting unfairly or who can be characterized as villains. It's unbelievable.
Well, and I think as conservatives, we're really bad at communicating just how much better, and like you point out, no one's been really great at this, but much better the conservative side of the spectrum has been on Indigenous issues. The First Nations transparency law, that was brought forward by women who live on reserve. It was sort of a CTF, Canadian Taxpayers Federation initiative to bring accountability, because the ladies who lived on reserve wanted to know what the chief was spending the money on. But if you spoke out, because the chief and band council control everything, well, you might just get kicked out of your house. And so this law was in place to provide Indigenous people the same rights to know what their town council is up to that I have as a person who doesn't live in an Indigenous community. But let's roll way back a little bit, and we'll talk to Jean Chretien in a second, because why aren't people banging down that guy's door? He's still alive, in case you didn't know. Diefenbaker, Conservative Prime Minister from the West, the first one. Guess who gave the right to vote, the enfranchisement to Indigenous people? It was a Conservative Prime Minister from the West. Up until that time, liberal paternalists from, Laurentia, they decided that Indigenous people were simply wards of the state, and they couldn't make up their own mind about who they wanted to be in charge of the country. It was a Conservative Prime Minister who gave Indigenous people the right to vote. To our country's great shame, it did not get done until 1960.
Yeah, it's absolutely unbelievable. And it's people often forget that a great deal of the residential school issues occurred under Justin Trudeau's own father. So Justin Trudeau is constantly pointing the finger at the past, but he never mentions the fact that his father was the one orchestrating a great deal of this, and publicly so. The Liberal government has been very embattled in court with Indigenous communities from the get-go. I wanted to jump back to your point, though, about that Indigenous transparency thing. I think the reason that the Liberals struck back so hard, and Jocelyn talked about this when I did that interview with her, is that it wasn't actually going to feed into this narrative. And don't get me wrong, there are corrupt chiefs and they are taking money, but that is very often the narrative that is pushed to cover up for the fact that these massive Laurentian, as you say, cottage industry is the term they use, engineering firms, they're actually the one taking these funds. So much of the money the Indigenous communities have no authority over. And this is why you'll see crazy things like when we did our Repair the Church campaign, they couldn't get $12,500 from the government of Canada to fix their roof. They couldn't get maintenance budgets. But 10 blocks away, there's a new sporting facility because they got funds for that. So tons of money is going through these councils, but very often it's designated so that these engineering firms and these elite friends get these massive contracts to make these really big buildings. And so it'll go under the chief, but they basically, it's like a cash stop. So the government puts money into the chief, into the band, and it sits in an account for all of half an hour. Then it's transferred to engineering firms. But it's the same thing. It's interesting, like other organizations, the mafia use the Vatican for this. You're seeing it in Canada. They basically use it as a smokescreen. So then when these infrastructure projects disappear, or you're seeing $25 million being given to an organization that's only making a $10 million building, it's smoke screen. It's protected by that sort of idea of Indigenous autonomy. But realistically, what's happening is you're seeing a bunch of money either being laundered or squandered, or frankly trafficked towards organizations. But it's masked. So that's a great deal of what's happening there. So I think what would have happened if that Indigenous transparency thing, it would have gone far beyond people on the actual reservations having access to information like we as Canadians would expect of our mayoral council, let's say. And it would have actually blown the whole thing open on the Liberals, which is why they fought back so hard on that.
Oh, that's such an interesting point. All the time, it drives me crazy. And I hear it all the time from people who live in these communities saying, our houses are falling down. Why do we have a brand new hockey rink with a brand new Zamboni? And it's because the money is earmarked for that. And it's already earmarked and contracted to go to that sometimes liberal linked contractor, and there's a lot of those out there, to get the job done and then overcharge for the bid. While the people suffer. And while the Liberals say, look at us, we're building Indigenous communities, we're the good guys. Well,
and it's the same thing to the water situation. They'll build this brand new facility, and I mean the conspiracy theorist would argue that they're intentionally letting these fall apart so that they can build new ones. Some of these water treatment facilities should last 40 years, but what's happening is they can't get funding to hire one engineer to monitor it. because that would be what, $120,000 a year or something like that.
Yeah.
So what they actually have is they'll have a local Indigenous construction guy with no qualifications to monitor a plant making $15 an hour, and so he doesn't know how to change out UV treatment or chlorine chemicals. So they'll go to these places 10 years later, and the UV lights are crusted over and pipes are duct taped because this guy making $15 an hour is trying to keep it going. So you're seeing infrastructure collapse twice as soon as it should because there's no maintenance and they can't get funding for proper upkeep, which just makes the engineering firms more money when everything goes into the ground.
I don't think you have to be a conspiracy theorist to assume that the Liberals have the next contract built into the existing contract. That's for sure. Yeah. Now, we did mention Jean Chretien because he was the last, I think it was called Indian Affairs at the time, minister to sign off on the Indian residential schools. And some of you may not know, even though he does look like a mummy a little bit, like he's been dead for a long time, he is actually still alive. And I wonder why the mainstream media is not beating down his door when there are these residential school issues that arise all the time. They should be going to the last guy who put his name beside the issue and say, yeah, as a government, we are going to continue funding these things. It was Jean Chretien. But maybe he's old, and so maybe he's getting forgetful. Maybe he's having a Biden moment, a senior moment. But CBC, without an ounce of skepticism here, publishes this article today that says Jean Chretien says he never heard about abuse in residential schools while he was a minister. And this is absolutely unbelievable because there's documentation of the standoff that he had ongoing in 1971 in Alberta with Indigenous activists. It's in the newspapers. You can go get the clippings of them telling him that it's a nightmare in these schools. They have to end. You have to do something. And it was in all the newspapers, no doubt in the CBC at the time too, but CBC's like, no, he's not lying. He's a Liberal, just take him at his word. Let's go through some of this because he talks about his privileged experience in boarding schools, which must be fine. Like the Indigenous schools must be fine because I went to this fancy guy boarding school and it was perfectly fine. So it must be the same for those Indigenous people. Talk about out of touch. Anyways, let's go through it. Former Prime Minister Jean Chretien said Sunday that during his tenure as minister of what was then Indian Affairs, he never heard anything about abuse happening in residential schools. Chretien made the comments during an appearance on the popular Radio Canada talk show Tout le monde en parle. That's where Justin Trudeau goes to say weird things about kissing other men. There's a clip. You guys can find it. The problem was never mentioned when I was minister. Never, said Chretien, now 87, of his time in the department from 1968 to 1974. And we, like I said, that in the year 1971, literally everywhere, he was being just from the left and the right attacked on the mishandling of the residential schools. During the French language interview, Chretien appeared to draw a comparison between his own experience attending a conventional college boarding school as a teenager to that of Indigenous children who were forced to attend residential schools. If he were a conservative, he would be canceled and generations of his children would be canceled forever. I ate baked beans and oatmeal. And to be sure, it was hard living in a boarding school, extremely hard. Here in Quebec, we had to, I guess, be at a boarding school in order to get into university. In Shawinigan, we didn't have a college. We had to go to Trois-Rivières, Joliette. Okay, this is just Grandpa Simpson talking. He goes on to say, Chretien said he didn't enjoy sleeping in a dorm with 200 others, but he never had a problem. Stories of physical and sexual abuse of Indigenous children in residential schools were documented in the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Then it goes on to mention the discoveries at residential schools. The former Prime Minister's comment drew the ire of another guest on the talk show, Innu author Michael Jean. Respectfully, I don't think Mr. Chretien knows exactly what residential schools are. Well, he should, because he was the last guy who signed off on them. The word boarding school makes people think it was a school where we teach people to write, but it wasn't that. Well, it was that too, but it wasn't exactly his experience, I'm sure. He said that while Chretien might recall eating poor quality food, it doesn't compare to what children in residential schools were subjected to. I think that's enough of this. But yes, this is Liberals rewriting their own history, and the CBC is just like, okay, yeah, fine. But and again, if this were, I don't know, any Conservative MP, there would be protests in front of their office, and Aaron O'Toole would be asking them to resign.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if any Conservative leader would have been as responsible for residential schools to the same extent as Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chretien, we would still hear about it, and they wouldn't be harping back to, excuse my pun again, but Harper as the villain. They'd be citing whoever else's name, but nobody talks about the Liberal legacy of residential schools. The thing that's really, really sort of haunting about those comments is back in the day, the mentality among those sort of liberal Laurentian elites who implemented these residential school systems was precisely that, and it was a wrong mentality. But the mentality was, well, what we do for our kids is ship them off to boarding schools, so we're going to rubber stamp that. And we see the same problems with the water solutions, but we're going to rubber stamp what we're doing on this different culture that's more integrated and is more about the communal aspect. So what they're doing is they're sticking that in categorically. So that mentality still pervades the Laurentian mentality, but beyond that, they're so isolated from the real world and reality that they think that their bougie boarding school, privately funded, fancy boarding school is equivalent. They don't understand anyone living outside of that. It's almost as though they envision chauffeurs picking these Indigenous kids up every day and taking them to boarding school and bringing them back for the weekends. Like, it's so diluted and disconnected from reality.
Adam, he ate beans, okay? He ate beans.
Yeah. Oh, my poor... Yeah, it's unbelievable. But that mentality is pervaded from Pierre Elliott Trudeau all the way through to Justin Trudeau. And it's this ignorance that, well, Justin Trudeau can show up and he went to boarding school, heaven forbid, I don't know if he did, but he can come up and he'll make an appearance and then all the Indigenous people will be happy. And it's a show of solidarity because he's been through something. It's absolutely ridiculous and it's disjointed from reality.
AD, can you throw that tweet up again from Charlie Angus? He's a lifer NDP MP, and actually he's the NDP MP for, I think, the riding that encompasses Attawapiskat, I think, which was the most, I guess, high-profile mismanagement of funds on an Indigenous reserve. Teresa Spence, Chief Chicken Noodle, she went on a hunger strike in Ottawa to protest accountability measures because people were like, what's happening to all the money? Well, as it turns out, her boyfriend was doing some hanky things with him, and I think he ultimately ended up being charged with fraud. He was the bookkeeper. Her white boyfriend was the bookkeeper at the band. But anyway, Charlie Angus was sort of fine with that sort of bad stuff happening to run-of-the-mill Indigenous people because that's the victims here of the chiefs like Teresa Spence. Those are the victims, the people who have to live there. And Charlie Angus went to bat for Teresa Spence and not the people of Attawapiskat. But now at least he's, a stopped clock is right twice a day, and he's right this time. Jean Chretien is a liar. When he was Indian Affairs Minister, teachers at St. Anne's Residential School begged him to intervene to help the children. He did nothing. AD, I also sent you a couple of newspaper clippings in Slack. You might want to dig those up. They're both from 1971. And they detail the... Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say there is this perpetual, throwback and distraction to the past, and the CBC, I think they're in a way complicit. They're redirecting away from Justin Trudeau, who's facing criticism right now, and directing towards Jean Chretien. It's always perpetually looking to the past instead of living where we are and addressing the concerns that are right before us, that Justin Trudeau is not, in fact, despite all his virtue signaling, doing anything about this. Jean Chretien at least had the decency to not pretend to care back then and not pretend to care today. Justin Trudeau, all he does is talk about how much he cares about this, and they're going to work together and they're going to do this stuff, but he never actually does anything. And that the hypocrisy is absolutely glaring.
AD says he has one. Yeah, so this is Indian plight sparks student letter drive, and this is coming out of Alberta. Again, conservatives don't really get a good rap when it comes to Indigenous issues, but a lot of these issues, the change comes from the West. University of Alberta students hope to flood Indian Affairs Minister Jean Chretien with 10,000 letters protesting the conditions on reserves in the northeastern part of the province. It's the Indian day school issue that was sort of in and around what is now the Lakeland area of Bonnyville and St. Paul. The effort, announced in conjunction with a speaking appearance at the university Wednesday night by Harold Cardinal, president of the Indian Association of Alberta, is being pushed as hard as possible. Ian McDonald, a student union vice president, said Thursday. Form letters with spaces for the sender's name and address can be separated from red-colored pamphlets, blah, 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 blah. But the letter says, in part, it is a deplorable situation when funds from your department are spent on white schools that only allow 10% of the enrollment to be Indian. Mr. Trudeau once said the Indian problem will be settled in the forum of the Canadian public. If your department doesn't act soon, it can count on further and stronger action from myself and thousands of other Albertans. The pamphlet also provides the Ottawa telephone numbers of Alberta members of Parliament. So 10,000 form letters with regard to Jean Chretien's appearance at the University of Alberta, and he says he didn't know anything about it. Give me a break, you big fat liar.
The scary thing is with liberal government. With liberal governments, you can not that I believe it, but you almost can. Justin Trudeau, I don't think he knows what's going on across the country half the time. So, but I mean, this is so glaring that to deny it outright is a categorical lie. But I don't doubt that 10,000 letters were sent. He never looked at one of them because they don't care really about Indigenous issues, and they don't care about Western perspectives on Indigenous issues or any other issues for that matter.
Again, Jean Chretien, this maybe is not a recent development of what I suspect is senility, because he's always been this out of touch and clueless. Another article from the Canadian Press from 1971, Indian upsurge healthy, Chretien says. This is when Indigenous people were giving him the business left and right. And he's basically saying, well, that's good that they're fighting for something, not like, oh, what am I doing? Why are they so mad? Let me fix it. No, he's like, oh, good for them standing up. Good. Look at them doing stuff. Let's read a little bit. Indian Affairs Minister Jean Chretien says the current vocal militancy, of Indians is a healthy sign, has renewed his own attack against Harold Cardinal, leader of the Indian Association of Alberta. It's difficult, but it's not a bad sign that now they speak up and express their grievances. That's a healthy sign, because for too long they were not saying anything. So this, I mean, it's clueless, but it also debunks his new theory that I didn't hear anything, because he was hearing it, obviously. Referring to his current dispute with Cardinal, he repeated his comment made in the Commons Wednesday. So, again, this is easily findable in House of Commons transcripts. Some people are trying to build up some sort of little bureaucracy around themselves, and they are not serving the people they should serve. The blow-up with Cardinal began a week ago when the Indian leader told a television interview that Chretien was withholding funds for an Indian cultural center in Alberta to try to force the end of the Indian school strike in northeastern Alberta. So he was blackmailing them to try to stop the protests regarding the Indian residential schools and Indian day schools in the Lakeland region. So he was literally blackmailing Indigenous people to try to shut them up. But again, he's on CBC rewriting his own history. And I have a theory about that, why CBC is letting this go on. A couple of days ago, Justin Trudeau was chided by Jean Chretien, which, I mean, he's insane and he is not a nice man. Not insane, but I think he's a callous, not nice man. And crooked as the day is long, if you want to go back to the sponsorship scandal, and he's blackmailing Indigenous people to shut up about the conditions in their own schools. But he chided Justin Trudeau over his slow efforts to free the two Michaels. And so now we're trotting out Jean Chretien and sort of having him say crazy things about the Indigenous schools, knowing that if you push him a little bit on it, he'll say something crazy, and it deflects everything away from Justin Trudeau. You know, he makes a good
Justin
point.
Trudeau twice.
Yeah, he makes a good point about this. Again, stopped clock, right, twice a day. He makes a good point about this. So how do we do that? We get him talking. How do we end the like, oh, look, Justin Trudeau's being criticized by Liberals. This is really bad for Justin Trudeau. How do we end that? Oh, let's just get old man Trudeau talking about residential schools, and that'll make him look like a crazy person. So here we are.
The old distract. The other thing that was hauntingly similar there was, like, Jean Chretien is basically the one perpetrating these injustices, or at least not doing anything about them. And then he's like, it's so wonderful that these people are speaking out. How different is that from Justin Trudeau, Jean Chretien to Justin Trudeau? He's literally saying, well, we need to stand with these people, and it's so great that they're having voices. We need to make sure their voices are heard. You're the one who's not helping them. You're the government. You're the one who's not filling these responsibilities, providing clean drinking water. You're the one they're speaking against, and you're doing the same thing Jean Chretien did. And you said, it's wonderful that we're having these dialogues. It's like the dialogue is directed towards you. You're the government, and you're the one not taking action. You can't espouse it as though it's yours. And I love that clip. It was in the Raise Our Flag video of the chief, I think it was a chief, the Indigenous chief, calling out Justin Trudeau as he's sitting right beside her, because that's what we need. And Indigenous voices, like, these aren't silly, defenseless people, and they're frankly fed up. And you're going to see in the coming months, some of these people behind the scenes, there's some incredible Indigenous follows on Twitter. People are becoming active and educated, and they're saying enough is enough, and we're not going to stand for this anymore. They're no longer going to be pushed around by liberal elites who often use them as tokens instead of acknowledging them as a distinct culture and human beings. And they're starting to say enough is enough, and things are going to change on the horizon. I'm quite sure of that.
I wonder, maybe we could just throw up some viz of Adam's efforts to rebuild the church on Tsuut'ina, because, this is not just something that we talk about. We're actually trying to do something about it, where other people like Justin Trudeau, he lowers the flag and he just lends lip service to Indigenous issues. You went out, you talked to First Nations people, you said, what do you need, particularly on the church issue, while their churches are being burned by white activists all across the country. You went there, you said, how do we keep you in your church while other people are burning it down? We want to keep you in your church. So you went there and you did something that the activists aren't doing. Speak directly to Indigenous people of faith and offer some help. And luckily and gratefully, we had a lot of help from a lot of generous rebel crowdfunders who got behind your initiative to rebuild the church there.
And so for Andrew, so you can pull it up, it was repairthechurch.com was the campaign. And it was pretty incredible because it started very organically. Andrew, let me know when you've got it pulled up. Started very organically. We actually went out to the Calgary Stampede of all things. And one of the first people we talked to, her grandfather, coincidentally happened to build the church out at Tsuut'ina. So it was very much integrated into their story. I guess we got the clip coming right now. We'll jump straight to that.
Audio 80.
To see what small stuff we can do to maintain a face again for my grandpa's church.
As we've kind of seen, there's a bit of damage, there's some leaks. What would it mean to you and the community for us to take care of the roof and get everything back into working order?
Oh, it would be so great. It would be just awesome. We never had the money to renovate it or to fix it up, so we just try and keep it the best way we can.
So I'm here with Chief Roy Whitney, One Spot. You are the chief out here on the Tsuut'ina land.
Pleased to hear that this is an initiative that will help the community repair the church. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this with Rebel News.
With the help of our passionate and principled viewers at Rebel News, we are going to crowdfund a new roof for this church building. While radicals and progressives out there are attacking places of worship, we're going to do our very best to support those places of worship. If you want to help, go to repairthechurch.com. Adam Soos for Rebel News, and we are once again on Tsuut'ina Nation land at the church out here. Churches and places of worship should be honored and respected. That's something that we as Canadians have understood since time immemorial. But that has changed recently with over 50 acts of vandalism and arson at churches across this country. That moral pillar has shifted. We're going to continue to cover stories about the attacks on these places of worship across Canada. But we want to do more than simply talk about the fact that churches should be honored and respected. We actually want to do something about it.
So yeah, that was, like I was saying before, though, it was a completely sort of organic thing. We were at Calgary Stampede. One of the first people we talked to, we were talking actually about residential schools, and she pretty quickly transitioned into the topic of these churches being attacked. She then let us know that her own grandfather and some other elders in the community built a church together. They designated, you saw the Starlight name on her shoulder, they designated some of his land to this church property, and the church sits there to this day. Like we talked about, it's very difficult to get funds to do repairs or maintenance. So on her first interview, she just said it'd be nice if we could do something to fix it up a little bit. Right away, I was with K2, of course, as usual, and we kind of gave each other the nod, called Ezra right away. He said, yes, we can do this. So our viewers got right on it. And I think that that's important. One of the comments that we received that really meant a lot was, it's really nice to see someone doing like virtuous actions instead of just virtue signaling. We want to make a difference in Indigenous lives, and we're going to continue. We're working on some other projects to not just speak about it. We want to be different from CBC, who hops to some Queen's University professor, often a white person, and gets their input from an ultra-Laurentian perspective. We don't want to do that. We want to go talk to the chiefs who are fighting for their people and the Indigenous communities that are banding together and are willing to speak to us and are willing to make a difference. There's a lot of pride in these communities, and very often if they're given an opportunity to rally together, they will jump to that. So we want to be certainly telling the other side of the story. Part of that is having Indigenous voices heard, and not just those Indigenous voices who are marching in line with the Liberal Party, and not just those university-educated professors who are speaking on behalf of the Indigenous communities, but the actual members of the communities themselves.
Yeah, just as an aside, as a Catholic, it's so nice to see my faith reflected in somebody else's culture like that. Pope John Paul was so adamant about, leaving the Eastern churches alone, because it is it's Jesus is somebody for everybody, and our faith is for every culture. And I love seeing the uniqueness of our faith reflected in Indigenous communities. I think it's great. I encourage people to go ahead.
Just check out those videos, because the sort of story that started it all was actually they were taking part in like a pilgrimage. I think it was around Ash Wednesday, and they basically had a vision, and very much in their tradition, they had a vision of this church in this place. So that's why they wanted to preserve it. They didn't want to knock it down and have a new building. It's very much their Indigenous culture in which they had a vision that this place of worship should be here. And then our effort was entirely to acknowledge and respect that. They don't want us looking down on them. They want us walking beside them. They want us, very often they said, people often talk about Indigenous issues, but they won't sit down and have tea with us. They won't hear our stories. That's very much what we're hoping to do.
Yeah, that's what I loved about your efforts here, was you went to them and said, okay, what do you need? How can we help? We have the ability to help. You tell us what you need and we can make that happen. It wasn't like, a bunch of white colonial people coming in there taking charge and saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this on this time frame. You tell us what you need and we'll make it happen. And I really appreciate the respect with which you approach that story.
Yeah, thanks.
I think we should maybe get to a few of these chats, and then we might have to evacuate. Well, not might have to. We definitely will have to evacuate YouTube for a safer platform. So if you are watching on YouTube, get your Rumble on your other screen and get ready to disconnect from one and move to the other after we take a couple of these chats until we get into like the danger zone. So the first one is from, hang on, let's get from former YouTube watcher, says Chretien called Alberta a bunch of complainers because they voted yes on the equalization question. The guy still has no respect for Albertans. I think he doesn't have any respect for anybody. Canadian taxpayers in general. I mean, don't even get me started on the sponsorship scandal. It's in the Liberal DNA to just cycle taxpayers' money to their friends and donors and then back around. And yeah, I mean, he has no respect for Alberta. He is part of the reason that Albertans, a decade and a half ago, 2 decades ago, we were like ready to go. We were ready to evacuate the country and plot our own course. And it has a lot to do with that Laurentian elitism that just oozes still out of old man Chretien.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's going after everyone, including bean makers now. It's ridiculous. Chretien won't give anyone a break.
He had to eat beans. That's horrible. Poor guy.
I know, right?
I mean, I know it's the same as drinking mercury poisoned water. Definitely, old man Trudeau. Yeah. Definitely. Kane and Mark gives us $1 and says, shout out to Adam Soos. I see him and K2 every weekend at the Calgary Freedom Walk. Shout out to AD. Do you have your own graphic yet, AD?
No other media outlets, but yeah, we're there. We're always there.
You can sort of tell when the other media roll up because they're wearing masks all the time, standing outside in a crowd, just wearing masks. Okay, AD, you got your own graphic going? You need your own graphic. That's a Justin graphic. Yeah. You need your own behind the camera personality for these people, AD. Work on it when you're not working on the million other things we have you working on.
What he gets.
You know what? That is a great YouTube community question. Yeah. What should AD's shout out graphic be? Trini Canadian gives us $2. Not only does the government need to take action for Aboriginal people, but the Aboriginal people have to start looking within and holding their own government accountable. A lot of these chiefs are corrupt. And again, when they tried, the Liberals, the colonialist, paternalist Liberals stepped in and said, you guys aren't entitled to those things that people in white communities are entitled to.
Yeah. It's so shockingly similar to what you see in like democratic states where they want the black communities, but only if they're willing, if they disagree on anything, there, as Joe Biden would say, you're not even really black. They want them fitting into this mold. And when the Indigenous people dare stand up and ask questions or demand some fair treatment, they're no longer their types of Indigenous people, so they don't want them anymore.
Trini Canadian gives us $1 and says bands get millions of dollars on mining rights, casinos, and businesses, yet we still cough up more money from hardworking Canadians who are generous. You know what? That is not always the case. One only has to look at Fort McMurray to see that these bands that have embraced oil and gas as a way out of generational poverty and mining, the standard of living and the unemployment rates in their communities much higher sometimes than the surrounding white communities because of their embrace of oil and gas and their partnerships with oil and gas. And they create ultimately jobs for people in the communities outside the reserve. So, but the problem is, I would put the problem on the Liberals and the activists again, who block oil and gas development and oil and gas partnerships. You see this all the time in northern BC when the Liberals are sort of drag their feet on LNG, and it is the First Nations communities who seem to be missing out. And then people like you, and I don't say this pejoratively, but there are Canadians who say, well, I'm tired of supporting Indigenous communities. Well, then you have to turn your ire to the Liberals and say, get out of the way of them plotting their own course economically.
Yeah. And I mean, I think what we talked about before, and the next comment speaks to this, but there is certainly corruption and there are chiefs taking money. But very often when you see these big major projects that are adjacent to a home that's literally falling apart and the taps don't work, that money is again earmarked and an engineering firm pre-negotiates it. So they have this massive infrastructure. Meanwhile, blocks away, the roofs are leaking. Some people may think that's naive, as the next comment suggests, but the thing is I've actually been out there and seen it firsthand. I've seen it happen where they showed me, for example, for the church that we fundraised for, that they've applied for grants for 10 years and never got it. Meanwhile, first application for a massive new sporting complex with hockey rinks and everything, they got $27 million for that or whatever it was right away. They got that money just like that, because that is something a Liberal candidate can show up to for a ribbon opening ceremony. Fixing all the roofs on small churches and houses, well, that doesn't make for good press. So that type of work, unfortunately, gets pushed out to the margins and gets neglected. And this is when you see the nice big building office for the band office, the beautiful sports facilities, which very often feed into that narrative that all the chiefs are indeed corrupt. Some are, some aren't. But it definitely reinforces that narrative. Meanwhile, the actual people are suffering. They can't get around. Their roofs are leaking. Their plumbing doesn't work. That's the reality out on many of these Indigenous reservations.
Right. And I think this all comes back to, it doesn't all come back to, but I think it nicely dovetails with the accountability issue and the transparency issue. First Nations people should be able to see where their money's going. And if they see the Liberals are earmarking it specifically for this instead of you having your roof fixed, it will motivate more people for change. And it will also empower the good chiefs, because they can say, like, look, I would love to fix your roof. Unfortunately, the Liberals say I can't. And I think, if we had more transparency on First Nations reserves, like we have in every other community all across the country, you will separate the wheat from the chaff, as they say.
Exactly.
And John Entwistle gives us $20. John's a regular viewer, regular donor, says 20 years ago, the chiefs were telling the school-age kids to have as many babies as possible. Now there are tens of thousands in white foster homes. I was there at the convention at the time. And prior to that, John also says, he gives us $10. Adam must be the most naive person in Canada on the Indian issue. Sorry, probably the only thing you're wrong on. I think Adam addressed that.
I mean, if I could speak to that, I 100%, sure, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying there 100%. I'm wrong on more than one issue, I can assure you. I'm always learning. But what I'm trying to get at here is that the underlying issue is Indigenous Services Canada and the infrastructure set up by these Laurentian elite. One, because the majority of the millions of dollars being squandered aren't being taken by the chief who's getting $1 million here or $1 million there, as corrupt as that may be. It's the large-scale infrastructure corruption. And we're talking about millions and millions and potentially billions of dollars that's being squandered. But on the issue of chief corruption, if Indigenous Services Canada was rectified and there was transparency and there was accountability all the way throughout that entire system, and the Liberals weren't preventing that, the chiefs couldn't steal the money either. So I can assure you, I'm not. It's just I've spoken to these people. I've been out there. It's not a foreign idea where it's too simple to say that it's just the government or it's just corrupt chiefs. It's a far more nuanced conversation than that. And unfortunately, because of the way the structure is set up, crooked Liberals and crooked chiefs are both stealing from Canadian taxpayers, and that's why Indigenous people are suffering.
Yeah, and I think there's also a Western society-wide problem that encourages people to not be in a family together. And so that's why you have, lower rates in certain communities of mom and dad together and the kids being raised in a household where mom and dad are together. And so you see a lot of that playing out in communities that are reliant on government assistance, unfortunately. And it is one of the worst things the government has ever done to Western civilization is to incentivize broken families. And I think we see some of that playing out in certain demographics. And I think it's horrific. Mm-hmm. And moreover, to Adam's point, I think every person is entitled to know what their government is doing. That's why I work in access to information. That's why I'm an advocate for First Nations transparency. Everybody should know what their government's doing. None of it should be hidden from us.
And the other comment that I want to touch on, because I was also a social worker, so to your next comment, John, I dealt with these Indigenous issues firsthand from that perspective. And it 100% falls to the breakdown of the family, but it also falls to, when you look at how things are managed by Indigenous Services Canada, it's almost like communism. There's no motivation or grounds for improvement. So you're seeing the same circumstances on First Nations communities in Canada as you see in collapsing third world communist countries, because the human component, the acknowledgement of the human being's individual drive to make their life better is eradicated. That opportunity is taken away from them. So we're seeing those same circumstances. So what do people do? The majority of people in those circumstances, there's no motivation to go to work. You can sit at home. You can. There's no motivation to ameliorate your community. So people basically enter this perpetual trap of just being caught in the same caliber of life. There's no capacity to improve your quality of life, little capacity to improve your community. It's very much a snare that people find themselves trapped in.
Let's keep going. I forgot you were a social worker. So that explains a lot about your passion for these communities. Kevin Tennant gives us $2. Whenever I listen to Okie from Muskogee, I just substitute it with conservative from Alberta, and Mac Davis's "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble" reminds me of our Prime Minister in a sarcastic way. Yeah. A buck Aqua Skies 3636 says Chretien was a terrible Prime Minister, no different than Mulroney. No one really since Diefenbaker except Paul Martin and Stephen Harper. Missed the guitar, glad it's back. Well, that's nice. Fraser McBurney gives us $5. He's a Fight the Fines recidivist who's always on caps lock. And he says,
you have to shout
CFL a CFL catch for a touchdown. He says, I guess for a graphic for AD. That's kind of fun. I don't know about AD's opinion on football, though, or Canadian football. We'll have to talk about it off air. A buck from Aquaskies 3636. Your word on Dr. Down South. Tuned in late. Word on Fauci. Thank you both, and great work always. And I think we'll leave YouTube right after this. But my friend Mike Mayer from Freedom Honey, that's a veteran-owned business, boutique honey company. And Mike is also with People versus Predators. Great guy, him and his wife, Sherry. Or fiance Sherry, I should say. They are great people, and he gives us $5. Now, I think we should say goodbye to YouTube and just talk about Dr. Fauci real quick. I know we're already at our time to say goodbye, but I think just for the purposes of showing how censorious YouTube is, we'll just say goodbye to